Very good. If I can Good afternoon. Can I ask everybody to sit down, please? Please have a seat. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Christian Borgreen. I'm the head of CCIA's office here in Europe. Welcome to this third edition of our Transatlantic Digital Economy Dialogue. Today's event will set the scene and provide with stakeholders input to tomorrow's important EU-U.S. Information Society dialogue. And we'll hear today from a number of distinguished speakers and panelists, and everybody in the audience are encouraged to participate during the Q&As of the two sessions this afternoon, and also online using the hashtag US-EU Digital. Easy to remember. The transatlantic relationship is key. We are each other's biggest trading partners, so if we can avoid any conflicting laws, which will make it more difficult for startups to scale up in a transatlantic marketplace, that would be fantastic. We have a shared history, we have shared values, and we have a shared vision for a free and open internet, something that many third countries are pushing back against. So there's much more that unites us than that divides us. And only when the EU and US work together as partners can we hope to inspire the rest of the world and have them follow our lead, hopefully. So it is welcome that tomorrow the EU and US regulators will discuss how our increasingly digitized transatlantic economy will continue to drive economic growth, jobs, innovation, and provide benefits for citizens and our societies. Our modest hope with this event here is that it will help facilitate this exchange of evidence and exchange of ideas. I would like to thank our sponsors from BT, Facebook, Intel, and eBay for supporting this event here. And now I would like to invite our heads of the EU and US delegations to provide the opening remarks. Our first keynote speaker, sitting right here, Linda Kurogedo-Stenneberg, Director in DD Connect. And before your very impressive career in DD Connect, you served for the Swedish Foreign Service in many exotic places, including Brussels, including Bangkok and in Geneva. So thanks so much for being here. Thanks for giving your remarks here.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you very much to you and your colleagues at the CCIA for organizing this event. And I'm really very honored to be here with this gathering of stakeholders on the two sides of the Atlantic to address issues of the digital world that is concerning us all right now. And in particular, I'm especially happy to open this event together with Robert Stryer, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Communications and Information Policy. And he will speak right after me. As you know, today we have two panels. And the first one is concerning the future of the data economy, and the second one on the future of connectivity. I know that both Robert and I are eager to hear the views and the recommendations on the topics to be discussed. So we're looking forward to that as well. I'm sure that you will touch upon the emerging challenges and opportunities. And here I'm thinking data flows, artificial intelligence, telecoms reform, future networks, cooperation in international fora, and there are a number of other issues, of course. In the EU, as some of you know and are aware, free speech, data protection, open internet, and privacy are now embedded in our legislative proposals and our approach to the digital economy. So we now strive to build support for our digital market approach at the global level, nothing less, because a fully functioning digital single market is a great asset in the global digital economy. Actually, the idea is to create a level playing field, so it means that everyone can participate on the same conditions. Tomorrow we hold our 15th EU-U.S. Information Society Dialogue. It was named some years ago, as you can hear. The vocabulary has changed, where we will discuss many current topics relevant to the digital economy. And we will, of course, present our new digital single market initiatives, because we still have some of them in the pipeline that might sound astonishing to some, considering how much has been produced already. But yes, there are a few more coming until the deadline imposed by the interinstitutional calendar strikes. So we also work on the telecom frameworks, 5G, next generation technologies, cybersecurity, cooperation in the international area, platforms and data flows. The message we will hear today from a wide range of experts will be of immense value in order for us to have the dialogue tomorrow. So, before handing over to Robert, I would like to thank you all for participating here today, and again, thanks to the CCIA for making this event possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. Our next speaker is Robert Strayer, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber, International Communication and Information Policy at the U.S. State Department. He's also obviously head of the U.S. delegation to tomorrow's regulatory discussions. Before joining the State Department, Mr. Strayer was General Counsel in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Before that, he taught at the George Mason University Law School and practiced telecommunications law at Wilmer Hill. Mr. Strayer, the floor is yours.
Christian, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for all of you for joining us today. I also look forward to hearing the comments later today. We've had a very fruitful set of discussions over the last couple days, talking to industry, those in the Commission, individuals in the Parliament, their staffs, and some of the member states. So we've had a very fruitful time here in Brussels. I want to also thank Linda for her kind words. I enjoyed getting to meet with her and Roberta Viola and having some time with them last night as well to share so many of the views that we have in common about the world and how much the world can be enabled through digital economic policies that are in our common interests. As Christian mentioned, I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Communications and Information Policy at the State Department. That means that my office covers two major areas. One is cybersecurity. So there was formerly a coordinator for cyber issues at the State Department that is now merged into my office. And then the other side of the house that I'm responsible for is digital economic policy issues. That includes internet policy, telecommunications policy, and our engagements in bilateral and multilateral forums, such as the International Telecommunications Union. As Secretary Tillerson recently said, the partnership between America and the European Union is strong and is based on shared values and shared objectives for security and prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic. So it's important that we focus on not just prosperity, but security issues as well. The EU is our most important partner in the world on a range of issues, including on the internet. And I think that's reflected in the fact that we're now going to have our 15th Information Society Dialogue. In the United States, the internet now accounts for almost 7% of GDP, larger than the construction sector. And it's estimated that 75% of ICT developments go to non-information and communications technology sector companies. In other words, all companies are becoming digital. There's manufacturing that's going on around the world in very traditional manufacturing sector that is enabled by the flow of data that has to cross borders and enable the supply chains of those companies. And we know that's very important for our transatlantic economy. It's estimated that at least $1 trillion of goods transact between us a year, and there's more than $400 billion of information and communications technology enabled services provided between our two continents. And it's also well known that the amount of data that's flowing between the United States and the European Union is greater than any flows of data elsewhere in the world. And the internet is not just important for economic reasons. The internet has allowed people to share information with one another in unprecedented and indeed unpredictable ways just a few decades ago. It's allowed people to engage in public debate and allowed them to participate in their democracies and shape their future. So it's very important for that reason as well, and that we keep sharing with others around the world our joint vision for those values that relate to fundamental rights such as freedom of expression, freedom of religion online. The United States and the EU both face similar threats online. And that's in part because of the trans-border nature of the internet. It allows people in countries anywhere in the world to have an effect on our sovereign areas. As our economies become more digitally connected, of course, then, it means that we're more vulnerable to cyber threats. We're also impacted by digital economic policies created by countries around the world. If they seek to limit the flows of data, it's going to affect the ability of our people and our companies to engage in commerce around the world. In our view, cybersecurity and the digital economy are converging. Cybersecurity policy decisions made by governments around the world have resounding effects on the ability of businesses to operate across borders because of the cyber attacks they might face. Similar way, the digital economy, internet policy, and telecom issues shape the cybersecurity environment. And that creates path dependencies with profound implications for the evolving nature of the internet and the security that we can offer in the internet going forward. As we approach these complicated policy issues together, we also need to avoid the trap of falling into false dichotomies. We can certainly have privacy and personal data protection while at the same time having free flows of data across borders. It means we have to adopt smart policies rather than data localization. We each have our own institutions that we work within, legal institution, regulatory institutions, and we have our own public sentiments about privacy and other issues. But we can morph those all onto our shared vision for how the digital economy should be able to work going forward, which includes the free flow of information across our borders and between our continents. The U.S. government, as reflected in the recent national security strategy, recognizes that because of its significant national security and economic policy implications, that cyberspace policy is becoming one of the defining foreign policy challenges of the 21st century. So my message here in Brussels, at the ITU, in India and elsewhere, is that it will take open markets and the full participation of stakeholders, including industry, and including small and medium-sized enterprises, to develop thoughtful policies to enable the internet's potential as the world's engine for future economic growth. We've already created trillions of dollars of value through the internet, and there's trillions more available and many more opportunities to ensure that democracies around the world continue to flourish through the free flow of information. The United States and the EU have a lot of interests in common, and we need to continue working together. Thank you very much. I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you very much. And I now invite the first panel, our first panelist, to the stage here. You will be guided through with the help of our moderator, Andrea Renda, who is right here, and head of regulatory policy at the think tank CEPS. Renda is also chair of digital innovation at the College of Europe in Bruges and non-resident fellow at Duke University. Please.
Thank you. Please.
Where do you want us?
Well, just free seating, free flow of seats, as you wish. Okay, I won't say that again. That's too stupid, huh? Way too stupid. All right. Thanks, Christian. I will say a few words just to allow my co-panelists, the panelists. Yeah, don't leave me alone here. Yeah, no. Thank you. Join me here, and we have a challenging task here to really say something meaningful in 1 hour with 4 speakers, with an audience that I'm sure will be eager to intervene, to interact with the speakers. So I think I will immediately try to involve the speakers. So they probably were feeling relaxed because they thought that I would introduce the panel for like 5-10 minutes. That's not going to be the case. I will maybe step in a little bit later. But I am very happy because we have a super panel of speakers today. In order in which they will be called to the floor to speak, we have Corina Schulz, who's Director of EU Government Relations. We have then Kirsty MacDonald, who's Senior Director for Government and Policy in Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Intel. Samuel Larinkari was on the other end of the table, head of EU affairs for eBay, and finally Leonard Koschwitz was the director for European affairs of Allied for Startups. I have asked the panelists to be brief in their first statement, so to just give a statement of, let's say, 5 minutes more or less, so that, let's say, we cover the first half of this hour with the speeches and maybe a little bit of cross-firing if we find it useful between the speakers, and then we will open the floor to the debate. So if you have questions and you feel the urge to intervene, to the extent that you can exercise self-restraint, wait until the end of the first round of speeches, and then please preserve your memory because we want to hear your questions. Okay? So Corinna, the floor is yours for your 5-minute statement about.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. This dialogue is really crucial, so thanks a lot for sort of enriching it with today's event. Andrea asked me to give a helicopter view on different topics, a list, and I'm going to do exactly that, but obviously there will be time for a deeper dive.
You can also give a drone view if you want.
Okay, why not?
Okay, you do that.
Okay, I'll do the helicopter and you're. Okay, so I'll jump right in with one of the key themes today, data flows. But I'm starting with the intra-EU perspective. As you might know, the General Data Protection Regulation already allows for free flow of data, of personal data within the EU. This is something very important that we shouldn't forget. We're always speaking about the protection angle, which is very, very important. But the GDPR also has a single market angle, which is allowing for the free flow of personal data within the EU. So in this context, we very much welcome the Commission's proposal on the free flow of non-personal data, because this is really crucial to ensure the European data single market, because this was an element that was missing. Just to say that we certainly very much welcome the proposal, and we hope that it's going forward as planned, because it's a crucial element for the single market. But then I move over directly to the global perspective. As we already heard from Robert, it's really key to ensure the free flow of data also between our two geographies. And in this respect, the privacy shield is, of course, of key importance. While we as a company are not using it, so we're not certified because we use other transfer mechanisms, we think it's absolutely crucial to preserve it. And in this context, we really appreciate the efforts that are made on both sides of the Atlantic. The Commission has really done a tremendous job to negotiate it and also defend it, because as we all know, there are a lot of challenges to the privacy shield. And in this context, I wanted to mention the importance of the role of the ombudsman, and that we really, really need to fill that position. Having said that, it could be a woman as well, of course. So but we believe this is really key, that this role is being filled. Because if the shield falls, then we all have a problem. And also the companies like ours were actually not certified under the shield. It will have a domino effect, which will really be devastating. Very briefly on the digital single market, I just wanted to pick up one topic, which is normally not necessarily close to SAP's heart. It's copyright. But in this context, I wanted to mention the text and data mining approach that we've seen at European level. We would be very concerned if text and data mining would per se be seen as a copyright infringement, and there we would really also encourage further dialogue on both sides of the Atlantic, because the fair use concept that's being applied in the US is certainly an interesting way of looking at this challenge. And given that we have the same players on both sides, I mean, you have right holders and technology companies in the US, the same as in the EU, the situation certainly can be compared. So just to say that it's interesting to look at the fair use concept. We already heard about cybersecurity. This is certainly a topic which is very, very close to our heart. We're following extremely closely the cybersecurity certification framework debate we have here at an EU level. We are ourselves not necessarily fans of a trust label as such, because we don't think it's suitable to address this very complex environment. But speaking about certification, one could maybe look at the effectiveness of a process certification scheme, which we think would be more suitable to really ensure or to have it apply to the development, deployment, and operation of secure software. So just to say that trust labels we don't believe would work in a software context, but there is the possibility to maybe look at the promotion of a process-based certification scheme. Having said that, it should be a debate at international level, absolutely, because for us, again, given the complexity and also the costs involved, right, it's really crucial finding mission, again, on both sides of the Atlantic, because we face the same challenges, so there's no reason not to have a very sort of close exchange on that. And also look at the different partnerships that are already in place. And we also very much welcome that the Commission is looking at launching such an AI alliance, bringing the different stakeholders together. But again, the transatlantic angle there is very, very important. So I'll close here, and as we said, there is opportunity for further deep dive.
We will definitely have more opportunities to elaborate on a number of this insights that you've given us and suggestions, not least because I'm going to ask you a few questions about this later, so even if nobody asks you questions, I will. But I think that at least a couple of those items will be also touched upon by Kirsty, right? Yeah. And in particular, on the issues of the data flows, of course, your perspective is also quite interesting, and it would be, from my side, of course, my role is to add as much spice to the debate as possible. Also, it would be interesting to see to what extent you are in line with what Corina was saying about the data flows, and if you are similar concerns or similar hopes. And similarly, on issues such as cybersecurity, I think, and the certification in particular, it would be very interesting to know what your take is. So the floor is yours for your statement. Thanks. I don't know. You can borrow this.
Does that work? Oh, it's working. So yeah, thank you everyone. I'm Kirsty McDonald. I work for Intel. I was scribbling down what Corina was saying, and no surprises. There's a lot of commonality of interest, but maybe let me try and put some kind of twist onto what Corina was saying. Where we do have commonality of interest is, keep data flowing globally. Full stop. Right. We want rid of unwarranted, and that's an important word, unwarranted data localization. So again, we very much welcome the Commission coming in and trying to address that grey area. Corina very eloquently laid out, we have the GDPR, which is a free flowing market for personal data. What about non-personal data? And some of the instances we've seen of localization. The reason we want this, and perhaps it's interesting to think of it from a kind of use case. I've spent the past couple of days in meetings talking around ADAS and autonomous vehicles. You mentioned drones, jokingly, but if we're to start to look at these new technologies, and I'll talk a bit about AI as well, we're going to have to be able to leverage computational power. We're going to have to be able to train algorithms, right? And we're going to have to take things which are coming from an edge right through to a data center, and those data centers can be anywhere. So, for the autonomous vehicles of the future, which is uppermost in my mind these days, I think we really need to be thinking in terms of these use cases, these models, these algorithms, and how we're going to have to be able to access these securely and safely, and be able to work off economies of scale that you get through the free flow of data. So interoperability, another buzzword, but of course that's essential. And we can discuss this. What might get a bit more controversial is around how do we ensure convergence of legal systems, right? To ensure that flows aren't interrupted. What kind of tools can we look at if it's comparing European Commission adequacy decisions, again on the personal data side, with more CBPR, right? So privacy rules, cross-border privacy rules. So I'll leave it at that for data flows. On cyber and cybersecurity, which is very topical at the moment, particularly for the semiconductor industry. So I'll start with some more of a safe area, investment in R&D, investment in workforce training, and international standards development as kind of key areas. I think the government can lead, industry can support. Lots of these efforts where we're focused on risk management, best practices, and international standards. We've got the US cybersecurity framework, which is great. In Europe we have ESCO. Leaves a wee bit to be desired in terms of operational. It's very large, and we've got to get our arms around that. But these are kind of models that we can look at in terms of public-private partnerships to drive these standards. And let me get to the slightly more controversial part, potentially, is around self-certification and self-assessment. And we're having a lot of debate around this, and so we should. But we see these, Intel sees these as important additional compliance options, right? We're not saying this is a panacea, but again, we would take it back to a kind of use case model and look to see what kind of products or what kind of service is it that you're delivering. If you go through a full certification procedure and an industry certification procedure, and your product and your service is registered, if you've got a quick product life cycle, if you're going to have to move quickly and you want to release a product next year, do you really want to have to go through this, or could you be trusted to self-assess and self-certify in that way? So it makes sense, it's pragmatic, but I think we need to be thinking about the reality and the use case models. AI, I've got lots to say on AI. I don't know how much time we have, but I'd probably...
30 seconds.
30 seconds. All right, I'll give you my principles and I won't go into details. And this is all available. Intel has published an AI policy paper if you're interested. So foster innovation and open development, create new employment opportunities and protect people's welfare, liberate data responsibly, and rethink privacy, because privacy fits into this. We've got a lot more detailed recommendations. Those are principles and we have recommendations, but I don't have time, but I'm happy to come back. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you very much. I will remain with the two of you for a couple of minutes. Just I wanted to investigate a little bit more on a couple of issues. First of all, the interface between personal and non-personal data, of course, is not really very clear boundary, right? And the fact that there are two regimes and there might be two different speeds of free flows of data between the two sides of the Atlantic, two different policies, and two different sets of exceptions as well, for example, for the national security exceptions for the free flow of data. Do you see this as something that deserves some additional market monitoring over time, some joint dialogue to ensure that certain exceptions or certain aspects of the legislation are interpreted in a way that is favorable to the right balance? Because in some cases, we're talking about the harmonious flow of data, but not the full flow of personal data, of course. Do you see problems on the way or not? This is a question for both.
We see lots of problems, but we should be focusing on what the solution is, right? And I think the biggest problem which we're seeing in our industry discussions, and I'm sure as well as in the policymaker discussions, is this: how do we separate, this confluence between personal data and non-personal data? And what would be the best approach to do that, and what kind of governance structure should be around that? We know clearly that GDPR is for personal data, but what happens when we've got mixed data sets, and how are we going to actually what's the governance structure around this? And I'll be honest, we haven't really fully come to an industry position on this. But I think the most sensible thing we could do, and it would be great to have this transatlantic approach to doing this, is to think about the kind of criteria that would apply. We would need to think around the levels of sensitivity of the data. Because you can have personal data, which is highly sensitive, and you can have personal data that is less sensitive, right? So I foresee us having quite long discussions around how do we, around definition and categorization. But I think we have to be pragmatic, and I don't think, we're going to have this perfect framework that's going to work. But I'm glad that we actually have this predicament, because we wouldn't have had it if we didn't get the Free Flow Data Initiative in Europe. So,
Yep.
I think it's really difficult to separate one from the other. Under the GDPR, we have a relatively wide definition of what constitutes personal data. So, from a company perspective, I can say that to be on the safe side, in categories of data where we're not sure is this personal or not, we would say it's personal, and apply the safeguards and the data protection principles that we have to apply, and we actually want to apply. So I think in that context, to play it safe, it's better to consider data to be personal than non-personal. But you mentioned a very important term, the mixed data sets, and this is why the regulation on the free flow of non-personal data is so important, because what do you do when you have mixed data sets, and for the personal data you have the free flow, and for the non-personal you don't? Doesn't really make sense. And in that context, for us it's then important to have a free flow applying to both sets of data, separate, but also when they're mixed, and you often have mixed data sets. So that's really an enabler. Then in that context, the situation would be clear, and maybe they, just from the free flow of data perspective, not for the protection principles, but from the free flow of data perspective, you can say you're on the safe side. You have from either or regulation, the free flow applies, and you're fine, and you don't really have to, from that angle, decide what is it. Is it personal or non-personal? And although this was not on our list, I'm going to mention it, where we see more of a conflict and where it's really, really crucial that we make sure we understand under which regime we operate will be with e-privacy. That's a totally different story. Because if the scope's not clear on that one, and you don't know under which regime you're going to find yourself, you don't even know which legal ground to pick on which you can process personal data. But so let's not go there. But just to mention that I see the conflict rather there than if you have a horizontal principle applying for free flow of data for mixed data sets, then you're fine. But
all right, we might probably go back to this during the Q&A session in a few minutes. It is true that agreeing on the principles in this field has always been easier than agreeing it and then getting the enforcement right and the interpretation right. So this is why I'm raising the issue, and also because I want to squeeze out of you something more spicy, because this is Brussels. So the first statements are always official. That's me. My role is to go a little bit deeper, and this is why I spent a little bit more time on this side, and I'm now going to turn to that side. But we keep this alive also for the later debate. Also the layering of the different degrees of sensitivity of the data, or the different degree of the personal nature of the data, is quite interesting. It might make things even more complex to some extent, but also more manageable if it's taken from the right angle. On the discussion on self-driving cars, for example, there's a big discussion on the layering of the data. As far as I hear, there are 47 shades of gray there, so almost like the book, between the least sensitive and the most sensitive, and that's something that already gives you an idea of how difficult it will be to interpret in reality, in which ballpark are we, in the personal, in the non-personal data, or in whichever hybrid thereof. I suspect that Samuel will touch upon some of these issues, but he might want to also bring into the debate on the Transatlantic Dialogue a few more issues. So the floor is yours, Samuel, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, CCIA, for organizing this very timely, interesting debate. And first I have to point out this excellent provocation by, I don't know, it was Andrea or CCIA who chose these microphones that are manufactured by a company that doesn't allow its retail distributors to sell on online marketplaces such as eBay. I don't know if that was a coincidence, but I assume it was on purpose as a provocation to, so I'll just shout out the room. I think I'll probably spend my remaining 4.5 minutes on talking more on digital policy and transatlantic digital policy in the way it appears in people's pockets and in the form of their smartphones or in their living rooms in forms of their desktop computers. So eBay is, as I'm sure most of you will know, eBay is an online commerce platform, one of the online sort of commerce pioneers, founded in 1995 in Silicon Valley, so 22 years ago, which makes us a internet dinosaur, but we're still alive and kicking, and that 22 years gives us very good perspectives on digital policy and the way that online commerce has changed people's lives everywhere around the world. But many people may recall eBay as an online marketplace that facilitates sales between or transactions between consumers. So in the beginning, we're a C2C marketplace where most of the transactions were based on an auction model. So people would sell off their old couches and then auction off to get the best price in the market. But we're quite strongly involved from that in the last 22 years to a primarily B2C marketplace. So nowadays, really, most of our business is facilitating sales between businesses and consumers across the world. Most of our business users tend to be small and micro businesses. And just to give you an idea of the scale and figures, so we'd have in Europe, we have hundreds of thousands of small and micro businesses that use the eBay platform to reach consumers in their own country, in Europe, but also globally. And what is really cool about these small businesses is that they essentially all of them export. So the idea is that eBay is an open commerce platform that allows everyone to participate in local commerce. So if a small business even in the most remote region goes on eBay, starts selling on our marketplace, they have access to 160 million active customers around the world immediately as of day one. So we see that reflected in the figures. 93% of small businesses traded in Europe trading on eBay are exporting, and in average they reach 18 different markets. And these figures, of course, get very different if you compare these to the offline world, where a very small number of small businesses are engaged in exports. So essentially what we've seen is how technology has fundamentally revolutionized the nature of commerce and the nature of trade in the last 2 decades. So back in the days, the only way a small business could participate in international commerce was by tapping into the supply chain of a big multinational. But now everyone is a trade actor directly. So whether you're a small or micro or a big business, you can participate in global commerce directly and interact with consumers around the world. So when we hear discussions and debates on digital trade and transatlantic digital data and global discussions on this, a lot of people are scared of these concepts of the data transfers and all these kind of scary big words and big companies. And but in our view, it's nothing more than an American guy trying to fix his motorcycle and a Spanish guy running a spare part shop, and technology connecting these two, right? And so it's nothing as scary as that would go beyond people comprehension. There's really people trading with each other and connecting supply and demand, and that's where I think we see our role as well in trade policies to explain how technology can be a very positive force in enabling everyone to participate. Now, Just to maybe comment quickly on the sort of I think all these very important things were mentioned before, sort of free flow of data, artificial intelligence, all the work on that. I think we see our role as a platform there. Again, platforms are playing a very crucial and central role in innovating in technology and then subsequently giving access to users. So for example, in the artificial intelligence context or in the mobile commerce context, small businesses and micro business in particular just don't have the abilities to innovate at scale the same way as larger companies such as online commerce platforms would have. So that's again an example where we see our role in innovating in technology that facilitates the interaction between consumers and businesses, and innovating in technology that then smaller businesses would not have access to without using our platform. So I guess bottom line here is that platforms are largely across the society and the economy incredibly important for all kind of actors in the economy and society. And they've generated a lot of good things in the world. And obviously, there's emerging policy discussion on the role of platforms on many parts in many parts of the world. And we think public policy discussion on platforms makes sense, right? They are incredibly, there's a certain platformization of the economy and society, and it makes sense to discuss the role of platforms and what kind of policy measures should be put in place to steer that to the right direction. So in our view, I think the two key recommendations we would make in the context of global digital policy and platforms is one, you need to remove barriers that prevent users from accessing platforms. So for example, I mentioned the microphone company, I won't name and shame, but there are still many manufacturers that prevent their retailer partners from using online marketplaces as a tool to distribute products. And of course, if you can't reach a distribution channel that is that the market is heavily using, then you don't have access to digital markets. So you're essentially cutting off micro and small businesses from the online commerce market. Linked to that ability to use platforms is also removing barriers in cross-border trade. As I mentioned, almost by default, when you use an online platform, you're engaged in cross-border trade. So what is important then for platform using small businesses is everything really from VAT, customs duties, to harmonization of consumer laws, product-specific regulations, etc. Second, bigger sort of theme recommendation is really maintaining the innovation capacity of online platforms. The reason that online platforms have been able to grow and succeed and continue to enable third parties to have access to economic benefits is partially the liability regime that we have in place both in the US and in Europe. So, for example, without the e-commerce directive and the provisions establishing a limited liability regime, platforms would have never had the legal certainty they need to expand their businesses. Another example related to the VAT framework, for example. There's increasing discussion of whether marketplaces should be made liable for collecting VAT on behalf of their business sellers, which effectively would push marketplaces into a new business model, that of an online retailer, because if you're able to collect VAT, you need to have product knowledge, you need to do logistics and payments, etc. So our recommendation for policymakers would be to really understand the specificities of the platform business model and understand how different legislation shapes the market as well. I think I'll pause here and thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Samuel, can I provoke you a little bit more? Because
even more.
When someone says, our recommendation is that policymakers understand, you normally recommend that they do something, right? Or they refrain from doing something. Right. So even if they understand, but they don't do what you would expect them to do, then you would not necessarily be particularly happy about it. Do you see, in particular, for example, the legal certainty on intermediary liability being eroded on any of the two sides, over time? I pause for now on the VAT regime, but because that's probably another conference. But on intermediary liability, do you see clouds on the horizon, or?
Yeah, I think that's I think the copyright discussion is a good example of how misadvised some of the discussion is. So while I think there was strong commitment from this European Commission not to reopen and revise the e-commerce directive and the liability exceptions, as such, we saw exactly that happening essentially in the context of the copyright proposal as it came out of the European Commission. So in very briefly, I think in a sense like the way we interpret the original proposal, it would have significantly limited the impact of or the scope of the intermediate liability exemptions in the e-commerce directive. It would have turned all hosting service providers into publishers of content, and it would have introduced general monitoring obligations on platforms. So all these things going very much against the fundamental principles that have allowed the internet economy to flourish in the last 20 years.
All right, I'll keep it for the debate because I think this is a good element for discussion. But now I want to turn to Leonard, who's been patiently waiting for his turn. And we'll be talking about big numbers, although already with Samuel we're going into a platform that, as he was saying, enables a lot of small and micro companies to access the market. This is also something, and not that you don't do it, meaning your open innovation activity also involves many smaller companies. But here really the issue is startups. So you can have a transatlantic debate about many of these big chapters of internet policy and the digital economy policy, but also you might want to be wary of the fact that behind all this there are companies of different sizes, and there are companies that aren't born yet that might emerge at some point over time. So Leonard takes care of this in Europe. So it's very good that you are here with us to also express your wishes as to how the transatlantic dialogue could shape and improve the environment for startups. Thanks for being with us.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. Very important companies of different sizes and of different speeds. Mm-hmm. I think speed is a very important aspect there. But thanks first of all to CCIA, and thanks for having us on the panel and share some of our ideas and wishes. I think the good thing is of being last on the panel is, well, first of all, you still have some time finalizing your comments, but also you can add on and perhaps offer a slightly different perspective to things. Obviously, being said, we agree to nearly everything that has been said before. But so we wanna take the opportunity of tell a little bit of a story. A story about startups as the companies of tomorrow, a story about obviously the EU-U.S. dialogue on regulation, and a little bit about Robin Hood. So the EU-U.S. relations is something that is obviously very dear to our hearts, not only because Allied for Startups was founded 2014 by an American living in Paris, but also because we share with the over 40 startup communities that we represent today, two very important and fundamental principles. And these are, first, that startups are global from the get-go, and secondly, that startups need a voice in politics and governments from day one. If you imagine the life cycle of a startup, coming up with an idea and a team, some seed funding from family, friends, and foes, failure, starting again, and probably a few more failures and starting again, and then attracting money, venture capital from angels, angel investors, running a series A, B, and C perhaps until an exit or an IPO. Policy is probably something that happens rather late, rather at a more mature stage of a company. But we would like to argue that policy is actually most important, not at a later stage when a company has the understanding, the resources, and the time to focus on that, but policy has most impact on startups actually in the first half of that life cycle. Why is that? That is because startups reimagine the possible a little bit, and they think and invent things before anyone else does, which is a bit the idea of the thing, but this is why it is so crucial to involve them in the policy debate as soon as possible. And this is because, things that are being invented today are obviously not the things that are in the minds and the conversations of policymakers. So this is one of the gaps that we want to that we aim to fill here. But the other reason is that well, if business models are a little bit in a gray zone or not captured yet, but what regulation and legal frameworks understand, they're much less likely to attract funds. So this is also about giving entrepreneurs the competitive edge of proving to their to their investors that they have understood and somehow managed to navigate the regulatory dialogue. So by doing what we do, we don't think that we think that we don't only help policymakers to make more informed and better decisions at the end of the day, but obviously also giving entrepreneurs the competitive edge. So why Robin Hood? Robin Hood is because what we do is something that we'd like to offer for free to the startup communities and also to the startups that we work with. But when they grow up, when they come to scale, we ask them to give something back, to return to the communities and make it easier for the next generation of entrepreneurs to succeed in policy, to succeed in their business, including policy, obviously. So this is a bit of a sort of the alternative perspective and the mindset that we like to offer, and obviously this leads to a recommendation to policymakers to perhaps think startup first a little more often, and to perhaps if we can offer that a type of SME test for startups. If you consider startups being the smallest entity in an economy, you should really test any new policy idea and any proposed regulation against this entity. And if it works for that, it's more likely that it works also for the bigger players in that sphere. But it doesn't work from that. If it doesn't work for startups, the question is whether we would actually come to a stage where we have newcomers entering the market and turnover and a healthy change in the economy. Our recommendations touching on a few of the topics that have been said today obviously concern platforms, perhaps not in the way you've heard that before, but we'd like to draw attention to the fact that startups in the most cases are platforms themselves, but much more importantly, they do use platforms. One of the most popular articles shared amongst entrepreneurs these days is an article titled "Here's 300 free platforms that help you build your startup." Mm-hmm. The title of that article was changed a few days later, and I think now it's called "There's 400 free platforms that help you build your startup." So I think that is really important if we speak about online platforms, that we keep that in mind. And obviously data flows are something, and the free flow of information, which is perhaps even a bit of a wider concept, is super important for startups as well. And net neutrality, I think, is something where the U.S. and the EU are definitely in a position to show good leadership and encourage newcomers to enter the market. Lastly, I'd like to make perhaps connect two topics that have been mentioned earlier. We spoke about artificial intelligence. We also spoke about the copyright directive and specifically text and data mining. So if we look at these two in connection, artificial intelligence mostly happens, or more precisely, machine learning happens when machines interact with the rest of the world, with their environment. If we have image recognition, autonomous driving, if we have natural language processing, or any other form where a machine interacts with its environment, and the really basis for this is text and data mining. Why is that? Because, well, either you have a proprietary data set that allows you to train an algorithm, but if you don't have that, which is the case for pretty much any startup I've seen so far, you need to rely on data that's freely available on the web. Not to reuse it in a sense, in a copyright sense, not to reuse it to make it available for others, but to use the informational value, not the creative value, the informational value contained in this, to train an algorithm, to tell the machine how to recognize a shoe, a street sign, or anything else. So I'd very much like to connect these two topics and make data mining a prerequisite for any artificial intelligence and machine learning operation today. So far from me, and very much looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Leonard. I think this is exactly where the debate starts, because I think we've had enough, say, ideas and proposals. Of course, tomorrow in the Information Society Dialogue, the ones that will sit at the table need to have, as much as possible, a concrete idea of what are the different positions, also the different problems that are experienced by the parties on the different sides of the Atlantic. I have just a question for Leonard, because I think one of the most difficult things in policy making is involving stakeholders, and even more difficult is involving stakeholders that don't exist yet, right? So when you think about looking at the future companies, or looking at the environment for entrepreneurship, so at the potential fertile grounds for startups, this becomes very difficult. And without entering into the usual story of venture capital and angel investors on the US and the EU, do you see different ways in which startups are involved at an early stage, for example, in the policy process in the US and the EU?
Yes, absolutely. So I think there's several great initiatives ongoing. I think what we learned mostly, and what has proven most successful in our case, is to find a meaningful way of involving entrepreneurs in a policy discussion. And it is absolutely granted, and I don't wanna argue about that entrepreneurs have better things to do than spending lots of time on panels and speaking to policymakers, which is, we don't want them to do that. We basically want them to focus on what they do best. But if you involve them in a policy conversation that is relevant to their business and relevant to their ideas, we have met an incredible amount of passion and interest in the topic. So with one of the elements that I mentioned before, sort of giving entrepreneurs a competitive edge, showing to them that being aware of the policy conversations, being part of the policy conversations, gives them an advantage when promoting their business, is very much important. And what has shown also very important and useful is to meet entrepreneurs actually where they are. It's much harder to get them to Brussels than to travel a little bit across Europe and meet them where they are. Actually, by the way, it is very much possible to meet entrepreneurs in Brussels. Probably not in this part in Brussels, but it's probably worth name dropping our new home, which is B Central. It's a fantastic space which has been recently opened by 30 outstanding entrepreneurs and policymakers from the Belgian scene, including Alexander De Croo, for example. And there's 2 coding schools, there's a lot of startups, and they have event spaces. We'll soon organize a tech policy meetup there, so look out for the opportunity to come and mingle, leave the tie at home, and have a beer.
Okay, there's life in Brussels. That's what you mean to say. I want to open the debate to the audience. Let me see who has questions. There's one here. Meanwhile, get ready and signal if you want to ask questions. Please introduce yourself and keep the question as brief as possible, of course.
Thanks to
jumped, so I give you the first.
No, we totally agree. Obviously, it's of course the notion a little bit that Europe set a certain standard, and for data protection, and yeah, we hope that the world will follow to a certain extent, whether this happens or not. But reciprocity is very, very important, and So when looking at trade deals, we should certainly also should look at that, you know, that not only we have the vehicle to then transfer data out of the EU, and you know the companies, as you explained, applying the transfer mechanisms, but we should look at reciprocity as well, that the then receiving country is also having mechanisms in place to send it back. But in this context, and that was something I forgot to mention, and I actually wanted to mention, we very much look forward to seeing the text that the Commission we heard today agreed on free flow for trade deals, right? I think nobody has seen the text, but we heard that there is finally an agreement for that. So we certainly very much welcome that and totally share your perspective.
Anybody else wants to react to this specifically? No. I will see if there are more questions from the floor. More comments. Christian, you have one. You brought it from home. Different brand, I guess.
You can sell it on eBay.
I have a question about AI. There's so much talk about AI, which either is the greatest thing ever or the worst thing ever, the worst nightmare. Tomorrow, the EU and the US regulators are meeting, and they will probably talk about AI. I was wondering, maybe there's a startup view on this and a bit more established view on AI, but what should regulators do? Should they jump on this? Do they regulate it early on? Should they give it some time? What are your recommendations specifically on that?
Kirsty, first? Okay. To you. Should be working.
It's just automatic. I think we should start by focusing where there are areas of concern, because this isn't going to become a reality until we get acceptance. And arguably, how much of a reality do we want this to be, right? So I don't think we should shy away from the difficult questions. And I think, some recommendations around how it's going to change the way people work. So we need to think from a skills perspective, right? New skills for the workforce. How do we enhance employment opportunities? And we've got experience here because we've constantly been adapting to technology and new technologies that change that nature. So, retraining, upskilling, retraining would be like one practical, obvious area there. I think as well, and I've noticed that, and I've been glad to see this coming from Europe, is there seems to be a movement now to push around the ethical and social dimension of AI. And, we do want to have accountable artificial intelligence, right? And for that, we will need to, I think it'll be a case of governments and industry and academia working. And we do have, there's accountability principles that could be applied. We have those from the Information Accountability Foundation. So I think we will need to sit down and start to think about, the transparency in this discussion. And I think we just need to tackle it head on and have a very open and frank discussion as to what are the benefits for the economy, the benefits for society, and the downsides as well. It's a new frontier, so it's quite scary stuff.
Kirsty, if you were a policymaker, would you, from any of the two sides, would you see AI rather as an area for competition between the two sides of the Atlantic, or an area for cooperation?
I would see it as both, because when you start to look at the application of AI and you look at the relative strengths, I think both economies have significant strengths. And I mentioned kind of the whole autonomous systems piece before. Intel with BMW and Mobileye are hoping to have first fleets in in the next 6 years out in Europe. We're going to be launching in Munich, so it's going to be but equally we're trialing in the US as well. So I would see that this would have to be, and given the importance and the impact that this is going to have to our lives, as humans, I think that we really need to be probably more collaborating than working in competition.
There's also a competition aspect to AI. Probably, if you look at the amount of data that you can use in machine learning. I don't know if Leonard, you want to step in on this. If you think that AI poses challenges for startups in entering markets, or it's a great opportunity as well.
Well, I think the argument I made earlier about data mining and as an access, as a means of access, as a means of giving the opportunity to really anyone training a different algorithm is really crucial. So I don't see a competition problem currently, but I see sort of a risk that we're actually turning off the data tap a little bit for startups. But the comment I'd like to make regarding AI is well, actually try to make a bold comment, because I think we can't be bold enough on these things. If I were a policymaker on this, I think the one thing that is crucial is it is what we make of it, and there is a huge responsibility at the moment for policymakers to not only speak about the negative effects, the risks and the potential problems. The digitization more in general, the digital revolution, AI, whatever we want to call it, is very much what we make of it. And I would encourage every policymaker to find a positive example and share also a positive example in their community where this is something that is helpful. And obviously in our interest, I'd very much would like to ask policymakers to encourage AI as a sector, especially in Europe, where we have a huge talent pool. We have fantastic universities. We have, I think, more PhDs graduating in Europe on these things than anywhere else. And to really give these graduates, young entrepreneurs and older entrepreneurs, really any entrepreneur, positive encouragement that Europe is the right place for them to do this, obviously, I mean, AI is not a fairy dust that you can sprinkle on anything that becomes magic afterwards. It's very good in making small things really good. An example I've seen recently is that Twitter is now using AI to crop their images better. I mean, this is just a fantastic example. Another example where a former startup is getting active is when Spotify acquired Neeland to improve their music recommendations. IM is a company in Berlin that actually performs better than any big global tech company that you can think of at this moment in image recognition. But I'm pretty sure you never heard of IM in Berlin. So I think what we need to do is we need to be super encouraging for our entrepreneurs, that we don't lose the momentum we have right now.
All right, we're coming to an end of our discussion. Also, it's we are perfectly on time, and we also know that Kirsty has to leave. So, Kirsty, if you're really taking off after giving us the drone view, you're actually taking off for a flight. So, if you really need to go, you're totally excused, and you can do it now as I wrap up. I think we've heard a number of ideas. They're probably not necessarily all new to the ones that we'll actually have to carry out the Information Society Dialogue tomorrow. And but I think what I see as an emerging theme here is not really a disagreement on the principles in most cases, although there are a number of tendencies that, even if you've been all very elegant and polite, but I mean there are a number of tendencies that seem to have the two blocks diverge on a number of issues that have lingered on this debate during the last hour. But I think in most cases there's also a lot to do on the side of the interpretation, clarification, and implementation. And one other thing that I haven't heard but I dare to add here is experimentation, meaning that in most cases we are talking about something that is so uncertain, trends that are so uncertain, and combination of technologies that are coming to maturity at the same time, but they are different technologies merging in ways that we hardly can predict at this stage, is that there's probably room for trying different things in different parts of our two regions and share experiences and share best practices. And I think the experimental platform for regulatory cooperation and mutual learning between the US and the EU hasn't been fully exploited during all those years and the past decades in which we thought that basically Europe will be more precautionary and US less. I think we have a much more nuanced and much more sophisticated view today of how the two different systems work and develop their rules and implement and enforce their rules. And there's a lot to learn from each other. I think agreeing on a path towards experimentation and sharing of best practices in times of uncertainty might look straightforward, but I'm not sure it's on the agenda of the ones that will carry out the dialogue tomorrow. And of course, keeping the door open to the practical experiences of the companies that have shared their experience today, I think it's also one obvious path towards experimentation, not even to mention startups which are experimental by nature, as you were reminding us of before. So I think this is, together with a number of tiny little issues that have been mentioned, and even big issues that have been mentioned, I think should be in the radar of the ones that carry out this dialogue for the years to come. We probably haven't mentioned everything. Fortunately, there's a second panel that will mention more things, and fortunately, there's a lot more room for networking and debate, even in the events today, for you to come up with sharper and better ideas for the dialogue. Thank you very much so far. We'll go for coffee. Don't go too far. No, we don't go. No, we go straight away. Sorry. Sorry, I go for coffee. I'm kidding. So we leave. We're gonna be somewhere in the parterre, and so I leave the floor to my colleague, the next moderator.
Andrea, you're the only one who can get a little espresso. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we will quickly jump to our next panel here. We will have a great list of stakeholders who will be presenting their recommendations to EU and US regulators. And we'll also be joined specially, and we're very honored to do so, by FCC Commissioner Carr, who I hope will provide a little reaction to some of the things we'll hear from the stakeholders, and maybe give a little glimpse of what's happening on this front in the United States. Connectivity was on in the State of the Union speech yesterday, so we're very eager to and happy to have you on the panel as well. So please, panel number 2, we'll get started right away.
Welcome everybody to the second panel. I'm Brian Williamson, and I've worked for a number of years on issues related to connectivity but also applications, and indeed the two have come together to some extent. We have someone from Facebook on the panel who started on the application side but have looked at connectivity challenges globally. I'll just say a few words at the start. One is something that occurred to me last night, a sense of foreboding, which is we have this title, the Transatlantic Digital Economy Dialogue, and it seems to me that potentially the UK will need a dialogue of this kind in a few years' time. So we may have a trans-channel dialogue before long. On connectivity, just mention a couple of things. I think there's an awful lot in common, and one of the things that we have in common is the problem of connecting everybody, even in developed countries, has proved tough. I think we probably thought it would be easier than it has been. If I look back at the US had the National Broadband Plan in 2010, Europe a number of plans, and we still have a kind of group of people who have relatively poor connectivity. So that's a clear challenge, and the US has been announcing some initiatives recently on that front. And of course, even more challenging is connecting everybody globally. But it may be that we will learn lessons from that challenge that will actually feed back to the developed countries and help us connect the last few percent. Added to that kind of challenge of extending networks is now the problem of densifying them, which raises fresh issues. We're most familiar with the densification of mobile networks, which gets you into some very detailed local issues about access to infrastructure and so on. And it may be that the way we deal with those is different because the US has a more federal system than Europe, so you can do different things. But I think it's also true that we're probably going to see the densification of satellite networks, and I don't know if that raises any policy issues, but the low Earth orbit propositions, which might be one way of closing that connectivity gap. Lastly, I was going to say the previous panel at the end talked about artificial intelligence, and they wanted positive examples, and there is a positive example of the use of artificial intelligence to improve connectivity, which is, and there are probably many. Google has the balloon system, Loon, and in order to get those balloons to stay in a particular location, they tried to solve that problem with physics and weather forecasting and didn't, but the AI did. And they don't know how, is my understanding, but it did solve that problem. So it may be that artificial intelligence will help us solve the connectivity problem. In terms of order, I was going to change it slightly and have Brendan on last so he can react to things, and we'll just go through the list as it is in the program. So Monica first. And I don't know if people want more time at the end for questions than we had in the previous panel. There was only one question, but we'll try to allow a bit more time. Okay.
Well, thank you. Is this working okay? Yeah. Well, first let me start by thanking CCIA for hosting this forum, and thank you, Brian, for moderating. I'm glad that on this panel we have a mix of EU-based and US-based panelists, so hopefully that will contribute to our transatlantic discussion. We, as Facebook, really welcome the European Union's focus and efforts to remove barriers in digital markets and to embrace the possibilities that innovative new products offer. We want to intersect with policymakers and find solutions together. We see the EU as a key market for Facebook, and we want to invest here for the long term. Connectivity is at the heart of our mission, which is to give people the power to build community and to bring the world closer together. In my remarks, I'd like to speak briefly first to connectivity in the European Electronics Communications Code, because I see some of my code buddies in the audience are here. And then second, to creating an environment that facilitates connectivity. As we continue the trilogue discussions for the code, it's critical to maintain a careful approach, considering that consumers have benefited in countless ways from connectivity. Online platforms remain engines of innovation that are driving economic growth and competition, and it's important to ensure that Europe has the right environment to stimulate continued growth and support continued innovation. For businesses to invest and to innovate, there needs to be stability within the regulatory environment and consistency. In addition to stability over time, businesses also need consistency over regions. Yes. And to Brian's point, we understand universal connectivity can't be achieved through a one-size-fits-all approach or solution. It requires experimentation, partnerships, and a range of different approaches to overcome the different barriers that prevent people from coming online. The development of new technologies to connect hard-to-reach communities and provide content delivery networks and data centers are also important elements of the overall infrastructure required for online platform services to operate efficiently. At Facebook, we're working with local partners to experiment with and build out locally relevant connectivity solutions. The projects that we're working on include express Wi-Fi hotspots, unmanned aerial vehicles, lasers, satellites, and terrestrial wireless systems. In Europe, we've announced 2 submarine cable projects that are co-built with different European partners. One is with Telefonica that has a landing point in Spain. The other is with Aquacom and Bulk with landing points in Ireland and Norway. We also have a partnership with Airbus to demonstrate high-altitude, long-endurance backhaul connectivity. We are a co-founder of the Telecom Infrastructure Project, TIP, which is a group of operators, providers, integrators, and technology companies working together to generate new methods and ideas to lower the cost of network technology. TIP now has 450 members across the globe. Through TIP, we're working with Deutsche Telekom on a millimeter wave small cell technology trial in Germany. And so to conclude, an enabling regulatory and policy making environment is really necessary, is a necessary precondition to achieving connectivity goals. The continued growth and vibrancy of the global internet depends on the cooperation of stakeholders from government and industry and civil society and others. And governments are uniquely positioned to convene all of these stakeholders in a manner that produces timely, scalable, and innovation-enabling policies. But we believe that governments that exercise regulatory prudence and institute transparent and predictable processes will encourage greater investment and innovation in their domestic economies.
Thank you. Jens?
Thank you, and thank you to Christian and the organizers for the invitation to participate. This is absolutely a very important dialogue. As Robert Strayer said before, the Europe and the United States remain, solid partners economically, politically, and so forth. And so it's extremely important that to have a productive, ongoing discussion to get to common ground. So CDT, Center for Democracy and Technology, we're a public interest group. We're headquartered in Washington. We've been around for 20 years, which I guess puts us in the dinosaur category. And we've been active here in Europe for the past 5 years. So looking at connectivity, my remarks, I'll focus on some of the governance and policy choices that we think will enable or will maintain the internet as a global, open platform for the flow of data, for free expression, for enterprise innovation, and so on and so forth. All of the issues that we work on are global, so they, from telecoms policy to copyright, cybersecurity, intermediary liability. These issues confront policymakers across the globe, and it's inevitable that there will be different regulatory frameworks, different policy outcomes on each of these issues. So the challenge is to manage those differences as they connect to the internet as a global network and reconcile those differences. So here, again, the EU and the U.S. play an important global role in terms of the governance structures. So our recommendation would be for the EU and for the U.S. to continue to work together to maintain this existing internet governance system based on the multi-stakeholder approach. Governments, business, civil society, and the technical community should work together to solve problems and set strategy in an open and transparent framework. And we've seen the successful transition of the IANA function to ICANN as a very positive step. And I think this proves the concept of the durability of this global open system for governance. And it's important that we as Europeans and Americans continue to defend this status quo, if you will, because of course there are other regimes, other countries that have completely different visions for what global internet governance looks like. I think, as we understand it, there's going to be a push probably in the coming year in the International Telecommunications Union for a broadened mandate to enable governments to use this forum to drive a whole set of policies that connect to the internet. Whether it's online content, free expression, and so forth. So we want Europe, we want the United States to continue to maintain the current system that we have. And so my second point is also when looking at their own policies, Europe and the United States should look at extraterritorial impact of those policies when there's an access to the internet. And a couple of examples there. In Europe, there are controversies on free expression that threaten to spill across national borders. Some of these cases are now reaching the Court of Justice of the EU. There's a case in Austria where a politician went to court to demand that some comments were removed from social media networks because she considered them to be defamatory, and the court ordered that these comments be removed and also be made inaccessible outside of Austria's borders. So a clear, let's say, restriction on the right of people outside the country in question to access information. There's a similar case from France that involves the so-called right to be forgotten, which allows individuals under some circumstances to demand that search engines delist search results and from searches on their name. Now, this case in France, we're seeing that the French Data Protection Authority requires or argues that that the search results be delisted no matter whether the search was initiated from outside of France or the European Union. So again, that involves the free speech rights of people outside Europe or outside France. Final example would be the Microsoft Ireland warrant case. That CDT filed an amicus brief in recently. That case is now before the Supreme Court of the United States. We argue that U.S. courts should not be able to compel disclosure of communications content stored outside the United States. We think that this kind of extraterritorial approach, if that is authorized by the court, that way chaos lies. It'll be an invitation to other regions, other countries to do the same. So I'll stop there and just again reiterate the point that Europe and the United States should absolutely work together to maintain this global open internet governance structure that we have in place now. Thank you.
Thank you. Larry Stone of BT next. And you may or may not want to answer this question, but I wonder about whether there are differences between the US and Europe that you observe operating in both regions that are relevant.
Okay. No, I don't want to answer it. Thank you very much. No, I'll try my best. But, thanks, Brian. I was just reflecting on Jens and Samuel saying that they're internet dinosaurs at 20 years old. I think BT, its predecessor company was 1855 or 1860, so we feel a bit pre-Cambrian, I think. If that's the right era, I don't know. But anyway, thanks again for CCIA for the opportunity to speak. I think it's an important time because there are lots of commonalities between the EU and the US. So internet governance has been mentioned, where there's a complete lockstep, I think. But in other areas, trade policy, other areas which you link into digital, of course, and some areas of digital policy, there's perhaps whether it's convergence, but possibly sort of divergence. So I think that's probably a rich part of the discussion tomorrow. In tandem, and rather sadly for me, I'm looking after our Brexit process. So a lot of the issues which are EU-U.S. issues are increasingly triangulated with the UK to and through Brexit over the next, whatever the next period is going to be. So that's, I think, an additional complexity for most companies. And we're the 10th biggest mover of data, or in the top 10 of mover of data around the world, business data. So that's a set of issues which we're having to wrestle with. As we were looking back at history 20 years, I was just reflecting, I'm not quite sure why, this morning in 2011, I think the EU and US agreed a set of trade principles for ICT. I think the US then agreed similar principles with Japan, and then similar principles with Mauritius, I think in 2012, and that process sort of stopped. But I mean, it just struck me that looking forward, and given the sort of changes, technological, social, and otherwise, that maybe there's a case tomorrow, at least for starting a process of, well, are these updatable, refreshable, and something which there could be a common view in terms of using with the BRICS, with the ITU, IGF, to your point, perhaps with the WTO and the plurilateral dialogue, I think, which is starting in the on digital trade and e-commerce, and possibly also things like cybersecurity norms. So that's just one set of one thought, vaguely historical. On Brexit, the reason I mentioned Brexit is so we, as a company, provide outside the UK enterprise ICT services in 170 countries, all the EU 27 plus the UK, EU 28, I should say. And we have 8,500, 9,000 people in the EU 27. We have 3,000 people in the States. So it's a big footprint. And on Brexit, I mean, we've got a tax committee, a treasury committee, a contracts committee, a data and systems committee, a regulatory committee, all looking at these sorts of issues. And those are the sorts of issues which inevitably impact too on EU-U.S. So it just struck me the 5 sort of areas we've come up with as things we're, as it were, prosecuting with our own government may be relevant for this dialogue, some of which are pretty obvious, I imagine. Perhaps the first is the need for an enduring and constructive alignment on digital and telecoms regulatory principles, independence and remedies, just to sort of, and that probably strays into other sectors now like automotive. I think second has been touched on already, free and open transborder data flows, no enforced data localization, but against, alongside equivalence in data privacy regimes, and perhaps also a common language on national security safeguards. We're wrestling very much at the moment with what the data regime will mean for us in the future, and my colleague Till talked about binding corporate rules, model clauses, adequacy, and in that context we can't afford to wait. And also similarly, we were very interested in how the Shield developed. The third area, which is touched on the first panel, I think, was talent movement and development in the digital sector, but including exchange of best practice in areas like tech literacy and digital skills. I mean, things like the Institute of Coding, which I think was mentioned at the WEF meeting the other week, coding in schools, where we have a big program. Probably every company, every organization in this room has initiatives on tech literacy and digital skills. And do we, multilateralize them? Do we put them do we exchange best practice in a multilateral way? And I think DG Education were looking at doing that, but I'm not sure where that process is. Fourth, a web of agreements for R&D and standards collaboration to mutual benefit for the EU-U.S. and post-Brexit UK, and some of those exist, for example, EU-Israel, EU-U.S, hopefully EU-UK. And perhaps fifthly, just a personal plea. We were rather hoping that TISA, Trade and Services Agreement, would develop somewhere, particularly in digital services and e-commerce, and if depending on how the new détente develops post-WEF, if there could be a sort of a further drive to move the Trade and Services Agreement forward better, that would be good. I've still got some other points, but I'll save those, Brian. But just one final thing. A couple of weeks ago, or a week ago, I think the UK issued a 2-page digital charter. So we had so I think that's, again, if you look back at the UK, so the EU-U.S. ICT principles, then you look at the UK Digital Charter, and these are sort of almost like a sort of a continuum of a struggle to come to a sort of set of principles which everyone can look at. And it's all about internet freedoms and trust, and there's plans to create a centre for data ethics and innovation. So applications welcome for the director of that job. Similarly, I think that's an area which could also be, I think, a rich vein, data ethics in the information society dialogue, and perhaps that's something which jointly could be addressed globally at some relevant forum. Thank you. So I haven't answered your question, Brian.
No. Thank you. So I could ask the same question of Fiona Taylor of Verizon, but perhaps I won't.
I may avoid it as well. I think I might. First of all, thank you very much to the CCIA and Christian and for the reinvigoration of the ISD dialogue. I think it's something that we've supported extremely strongly. Everyone has mentioned it in the panel. I think the Transatlantic Dialogue has a key role to play in promoting the common values we share in international fora in particular. So that's to begin with. The second remark is, Larry stole it from me as well, because I was also going to refer to the dinosaur industry. Believe it or not, we're younger than you. We're only 17 years old or 18 years old. So I'd like to put that forward, at least as Verizon. So I think that's an interesting perspective to keep in mind. Maybe without doing a sort of marketing commercial pitch about Verizon, I think it's interesting to hear a little bit about what the company is doing and where the company is going, because that also helps define and frame a little bit what our recommendation, if I dare call them that way, will be. Well, first of all, we are a global company. We are mainly an enterprise provider outside of our domestic market in the US, but in the US we're a full provider of wireless, wireline. We've also invested in our media strategy with the launch of Oath back in the summer, and we're also focusing on telematics and IoT. And the reason why that matters is that there's, to a certain extent in our strategy going forward, one common thread is the connectivity. So the connectivity is at the basic layer of everything we want to build from a platform strategy, from an IoT telematics perspective. So looking at that, what would be the best or the most appropriate framework to deliver the aims? The aims being obviously the promotion of connectivity, the rollout of broadband, tackling the digital divide, etc. And I think we are very close to the principles that were put forward by Facebook in terms of how to get there. And how to get there is obviously having a careful and cautious approach, looking at promoting and encouraging innovation and investment, looking at where relevant, ensuring robust consumer protection and competition, looking at consistency of regimes, simplification of regimes, and to that I'm sure that we'll hear more about a lot of efforts as well that are being carried out in the US around 5G rollout, about trying to remove and address barriers to access to poles, to historical buildings, etc. So I think that's sort of a common thread that applies on both sides. I think the frameworks might be slightly different in how to get there, but I think the aims and the principles are common and should be further promoted. In addition to the interoperability of approaches and consistency of approaches, because again, we don't all come from the same legal starting point, so we need to also recognize that. The second is as well looking at the evolution and the emergence of all the different services, and to use the buzzword that we haven't yet used today is the famous convergence word, is trying to have a light touch regulatory approach. In that sense, I mean trying to refrain from looking at issues from a sector-specific perspective, particularly when you're looking at the emergence of new services, so telematics, IoT, and moving forward, where we are all hoping to get most of our revenues from, to be clear as well, is not to build on historical sector-specific regulation, but to look at market realities and whether it makes sense. I'll bring back maybe an example to illustrate that from the European framework, which is, for example, privacy and GDPR or cybersecurity. We have different segments of our business that are regulated by different tools and different instruments. And I think the risk is it's a recipe for disaster, in the sense that a mistake is easy. In that sense, we have the NIS directive applying to certain elements of our business, basically all the elements that are not ECS, like cloud-related services, etc. The same applies to the GDPR and the privacy. So again, I think that the difficulty is trying to find the right definitions in scoping what we're addressing and being cautious about potential collateral damage because it's being translated in other legislative frameworks that are interrelated. So, sorry, I went a bit deep in the European side there, but I still think it's an approach that would make sense on both sides of the Atlantic, but also in terms of common principles to be brought forward in international forums and discussions. Data flows is an obvious one. I think my colleagues have touched upon most of those that I wanted to talk about. So selfishly, I'll just bring it back to one additional issue that we haven't discussed that is maybe less politically exciting. It's the enterprise dimension. As I mentioned in the introduction, Verizon is an enterprise provider outside well, in the US and internationally for that matter. And the problems we face regularly in looking at regulatory frameworks is that they tend to be developed for reason with consumer protection in mind. But it also means that there is often a lack of granularity in the definition of what the end user is. And that means that in certain cases we are caught by regulation that may not be necessary in the enterprise dimension, thinking about the fact that the relationship is bilateral, we have bilaterally negotiated contracts, not standard off-the-shelf contracts, so they contain quality of service, transparency obligations, and a lot of other elements. So this is a bit specific to our business model, but I thought it was an interesting thought for us to keep in mind when we think about potential policy frameworks around digital, not only from a transatlantic perspective, but from a global perspective. And I'll stop there so we can hear more from Commissioner Carr, since we have the honour of having you on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And pleased to have Brendan Carr here to comment now and to comment on what others have said if you wish to.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on this panel. Happy to join it. We've had a really good, productive day and set of meetings so far. Arrived this morning. We've had a chance to meet with members of the European Parliament, with regulators from member states, and with a number of private sector entities and stakeholders. So it's been a good day, and also look forward to the dialogue tomorrow and some more government-to-government discussions then. But turning to the topic of this panel, I think the future of connectivity is extremely bright. And I think that for a couple of the reasons that we heard today, and really I want to focus on two things that are, I think, sort of interesting fundamental trends that are going to converge this year and the years ahead. Part of it is what Monica was talking about. We are at a really interesting time in terms of technological development. And she talked about some of the really interesting things that are going on out there, whether it's on the backhaul side or the last mile. We're seeing some really interesting developments on the fixed wireless side. A lot of these really interesting technologies that can drive down the cost of serving that last mile and the backhaul side as well. You mentioned one of them as well, which is these new satellite constellations that are being launched. We have all these interesting technologies that are maturing right now. So that's one trend that we see. On the other side, I think you're seeing a commitment to reforming the regulations that is going to be necessary to help get those new technologies across the finish line as quickly as possible. So when you look at the intersection of some of the reforms that the U.S. is committing to, that Europe is committing to, and then you look at the technology that's coming down the pipe, the intersection of those two things, I think is going to really be a game changer in terms of driving down the cost of connectivity. And we're going to continue to see more competition and great benefits for consumers. And to back up and talk about what some of those regulatory reforms are that we need to do, in my mind, it really comes down to the broad bucket of infrastructure, and there's two pieces of that. One is the siting, the permitting, the approval process. I had a chance to talk a little bit this morning in a speech about 5G and how it applies in that context. You know, we're all familiar with 4G deployments. In the U.S., it has involved relatively few antenna sites, roughly 300,000 in the country. And you mentioned densifying, and that's obviously where we're going with 5G. We need to see a 10 to 100-fold increase in the number of small cells that are out there. So that's 1 million small cells potentially over the next couple of years. The regulatory process, permitting, approval, fees that apply to these relatively few macro site deployments threatens to be the bottleneck that holds us back from 5G and from densifying. So at the U.S., we're taking a hard look at this. European regulators, we share the same concerns. We're looking at very similar solutions. How do we get it so that the cost of deploying these facilities goes down dramatically? If we can do that, that's going to really help close that connectivity gap. The second piece of the infrastructure that I wanted to talk about is spectrum. Obviously in Europe and also in the US, we have the shared goal of freeing up even more spectrum for consumer use, whether it's licensed, unlicensed, shared spectrum, and spectrum across the bands. So I think when you put those two pieces together on the infrastructure and you put together the commitment that we're seeing on both sides of the Atlantic to getting those reforms across the finish line, coupled with these technologies we're seeing, I think we're going to see a lot of changes over the next months and years to come.
Okay, thank you. I might make a few comments and then open it up for discussion. I mean, one of them is around, I think there's potentially some tension between some of the things that are happening, and one that Monica mentioned was the need for predictability, and I agree with that. But we also have a connectivity market which is, if anything, more dynamic than it was historically with these innovations. So there's a challenge there for regulators in making regulation predictable whilst at the same time adapting to these changes. There was also a discussion on the previous panel about the role of platforms in supporting application developers. So to an extent they're complements, but I also think connectivity and platforms and applications are complements. So that's not always how people think of them, but I think they are. They drive demand for one another. And that's one reason the future is bright, because as the application space explodes, you have demand for new forms and better connectivity. But then you come to the institutional question, which is a concern was expressed about applying the wrong kind of framework in the wrong place, using the wrong institutions. So how do we kind of draw the boundaries around the institutions in an appropriate way? And I think that's a challenging question, because institutions often want to grow the scope of what they do. That's a kind of natural thing to want to do. But that may create problems if they're applying a kind of framework that isn't fit for purpose in an adjacent area. But I'll open up to questions or comments that people may have from the floor. Over here is the microphone. Yeah. And just say who you are and who you're with. Yeah.
Peter Chase, German Marshall Fund. I'd like to kind of take off the last two comments, in part because people think about connectivity too much in terms of people-to-people interaction. And a large part of the 5G and the moving to more sophisticated internet protocol things is to build in the Internet of Things. A lot of it is simply enterprise connectivity. And transatlantic internet, there are a couple of issues related to that, and I'm wondering whether or not they will be discussed tomorrow about standards and protocols that are used in the Internet of Things, and particularly the industrial Internet of Things. Wonder whether or not, kind of a connectivity thing that goes a little bit back to the last panel, a lot of bits of information that are associated in an enterprise format, in a shop floor or whatever the case may be, are going to be pieces of information that do include personally identifiable information. It's not just machine to machine. It appears to be machine to machine, but it's going to go well beyond that. And I wonder whether or not and how that could get into the way of some of the connectivity issues when you're talking about the Internet of Things, but you can't really separate out the people part of it too.
Okay, thank you. Any comments from anybody on that?
Maybe just a thought or a remark, if nobody else wants to take it. I think it's one of the examples that we are struggling with for the moment with the e-privacy regulation and with the code. So the code considers that M2M, at least in the way it's clarified it, is not, it's the conveyance of the signal, i.e. the transmission, but not the service that is covered by the obligation as an ECS. So far, so good. And even there, I think some would question whether M2M, if all M2M services should be an ECS, because again, you've got different flavors of M2M services. There's no sort of one-size-fits-all M2M service. But then when you try translating that into the e-privacy regulation and the definitions around consent, it becomes extremely complex because the service is not covered, but just the conveyance of a signal. But what does it mean? If I am providing just the conveyance in a B2B context, in an agri-tech context where it's basically soil sensors. So who gives me consent? Is it in the contract from a B2B perspective? Is it from the soil sensor telling me that the soil has given me consent? And even if I am told, no, but I mean, these are real questions. And even if we're told, or the answer being, but the service is not covered, but the service is connected to the connectivity, so how does it work? And if I offer it as a bundle, then what applies to what and how? So I think that's a concrete element of perhaps a reflection that has been looking at mainly consumer-focused elements could have collateral damage. So I think it's a clear illustration of something that probably needs to be further taken into consideration. I don't know if that fits in what you were highlighting.
Any other comments or questions? Over here. I'll come back to you. Would you want to go first?
Hi, Jamie Patel with LVMH. With the recent FCC decision on net neutrality, we now have differing situations on this particular topic in the US and the EU. What does the panel think about that situation? Should we let it go ahead with this differing situation and experiment, as the first panel talked about, and see where the two end up? Or do you think long term that's going to damage the transatlantic relationship in all things digital?
I might comment on that myself initially. They are different, but they almost always were. So curiously, they've swapped in the sense that Europe historically didn't see the need to have any federal, if you like, or European level rules on net neutrality, and the US did have something, and now Europe does, and the US is moving to a position where it doesn't. So, I mean, that in itself is curious. In most cases, we don't see a policy switch, but over to others.
I'd simply say I think that there's actually a lot more common ground here than what some of the headlines you may be reading suggest. In the US, we reached a decision that reversed a 2-year-old decision, but in the US, we continue to believe very firmly in a free and open internet, and we continue to be committed to those principles. What our decision did was we have a unique regulatory structure compared to Europe. In the US, we have 2 regulatory authorities in this space, our competition authority, the Federal Trade Commission, and our agency, the Federal Communications Commission. One of the things that we did with the decision last month was we restored the authority of the competition authority, the Federal Trade Commission, to have jurisdiction and authority over our ISPs and our operators. So if operators engage in a lot of the conduct that people talk about when they discuss net neutrality, blocking, throttling, discrimination, we continue to have laws on the books, Section 1 of the Sherman Act, Section 2 of the Sherman Act, that will give the Federal Trade Commission authority to take action. So the extent that the headline is that the U.S. has eliminated the free and open internet, that story is not correct. We've shifted the jurisdiction, and we continue to have a cop on the beat that can apply law and restrictions to ISP's conduct and make sure that consumers are protected.
Sure. I would only just to quickly respond to say that Facebook was very opposed to eliminating those rules, and the reason behind that, we feel that the net neutrality rules need to apply to internet service providers because they control the access infrastructure, while online services do not. So we feel like that companies that control the access infrastructure just need to have rules, those types of rules in place to protect consumers that might want to navigate in an unobstructed way through while using the internet.
I would just echo that. I mean, we were here in the EU. We were very supportive of the European Commission's move that the initiative that became the TSM regulation that established those principles. We think that's the right way to go, and like you, I have colleagues in Washington who are working on reversing the reversal. But does that create immediate tension or unmanageable tension between the EU and the US? I don't think so. It's one of those cases where we had different political systems in place, and they are producing right now different outcomes, and we have to live with that.
It's possible, and maybe something to discuss tomorrow, that the gap in terms of what one would like to see in the market is not large, but there's a gap in terms of the policy instrument, the position on what policy framework to have. I'm not sure the goal is that different in terms of a kind of open internet. Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Yep. Microphone.
I have a little cheeky question. It sounds like from Facebook, so that the OTTs are becoming telcos in a way. They're delivering more and more of that connectivity. Are telcos becoming OTTs?
I think I left looking at me.
There's two of you.
No, I mean, I think it's what I mentioned in my introduction. The word that we haven't used much on this panel or the previous panel is the convergence issue. I think we are all transforming ourselves, and I was nearly going to make the joke saying we're still an adolescent, we're not yet a dinosaur, but it still means that we're trying to understand who we are. And I think we all are facing disruption, and we all are facing, hence the importance of the sort of careful regulatory approaches to issues, because there is so much uncertainty from a market perspective, from a consumer demand and expectation perspective, that we are testing to see who we are. But I don't think, and I think it goes back to the point about looking back at regulation from an horizontal overall market perspective rather than continuing looking at it from historical segment, is that we are no longer one segment. We are all in everybody else's segments. So I think that just goes in hand with the point I made. Yeah.
Larry.
Oh,
go ahead.
I agree with
please.
I agree with Fiona. If you look at, as I'm sure you all do, look at our distributable reserves as a company. You know, about a third goes to pensions, historic pensions, because we're an old company, as I mentioned before, with old people, including me, and a third goes to shareholder distribution, obviously, and about a third goes to investment. If you look at our investment, precisely to Fiona's point, you know, a third is going, quite a lot of that investment is going into a generational cycle of investment into 5G and fibre, which has variable and long-term payback depending on the part of the country. And quite a lot is going into the Internet of Things, which has got a different sort of investment profile, and quite a lot's going into content, including sports rights, which has a different profile. So for us, you know, how that's regulated and the regulatory cycles versus the investment cycles are very different. So that's why we like the European Commission's proposal at one stage about moving the length of the recurrent cycles of market reviews, for example. That was quite important. Just a second thing, just on net neutrality. I mean, I think the key to that is obviously antitrust oversight or FTC oversight. Clearly, transparency of customer information is obviously important as well. I think also the extent of competition in a market. If there are hundreds or dozens of ISPs, and the ability for customers to switch, I think is important. And one point we mentioned on standards before, I think it was Peter maybe or someone mentioned it, was I think the standards debates are getting more and more complicated in IoT, because you've traditionally all wandered to the ITU-T or ITU-R and get together as a group of telcos in the sector and talk about things, but increasingly it's involving the health sector or the automotive sector. So I think the whole paradigm for standard setting is becoming much more complicated and almost multilateral, a bit like the WTO, so hopefully it won't be as slow.
Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. Well, I left with one closing thought, which is we have this quite kind of complex, evolving ecosystem, and a number of times in different contexts, the question of unintended consequences has come up. So that's quite a tough ask for regulators, but there is something there about being careful of unintended consequences as boundaries change. So thank you, and thank you to the panelists. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, and special thanks to Commissioner Carr for being here and giving a perspective, a fresh perspective from the US. Also, thank you to Larry Stone for participating today. I know you're leaving, this is your last day in Brussels before you're leaving to New Delhi in India, so thanks for being here today rather than packing your suitcases, as maybe you should. Thank you so much. And now it is, finally, it is my pleasure and great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, who I saw walk in, and I hope he hasn't left us yet. Great. Roberto Viola, everybody knows him, Director General DG Connect. Before joining the Commission, Mr. Viola served as Secretary General of the Italian Regulatory Authority and as Chairman of the European Regulatory Group, just to mention a few highlights from your very impressive career. I'm going to end here, and please, it is our honor to invite you for the keynote speak.
Thanks a lot, and good evening to all. When one has an impressive, as you say, career, it means a long career, it means start to be a bit old. So, anyhow, it's really a pleasure to be here and have an interaction with you and really give you my feeling on our excellent transatlantic relationship. Now, we have tomorrow our 15th dialogue with the US administration. So we have a tradition which is as old as my daughter. My daughter is 19, so it's a young adolescent, this tradition, but it's very rooted and very solid. And I'm very, very grateful to Robert and his team that they came over. And yesterday we started in front of a nice dish of pasta, which is really a good way to start a dialogue. I'm really also honored that Commissioner Kerr decided to join. It's really an excellent, competent member of the digital community, and also now he serves in a very important role as FCC Commissioner. So we have a super competent team on the side of US, and I must say also my colleagues are doing their best to have the utmost out of this dialogue. I'm really pleased. Yesterday we spoke a lot about Italian and US cuisine and the rest, but we spoke about business. And I'm pleased to say that the new US administration is really determined, as we are determined, to maintain a very strong relationship across the Atlantic when it comes to bids that move both sides. I think moving both sides, bids, minds, investment, it's really important in the digital economy. I think we share the same values. I think we share the value that internet has to be an open, democratic space for a better social and economic growth. Social opportunities in terms of more democracy, plurality of opinions, openness to differences, economic growth. I mean, with the upcoming possibilities that you can see every day coming, 5G, AI, robotics, I think we are going to see a better society as a whole. I mean, autonomous drive is one example. I mean, you can have different ideas about robots driving a car, but I mean, the empirical evidence when you see robots driving planes, which is everyday reality, it's clear that it is much, much safer than humans. And if you consider that from World War II to now, there have been 45 million of people dying on the European streets, you also understand, I mean, what is the challenge in front of us and the opportunity. And medicine, I mean, looking at personalized medicine, the advancement in genetics, I mean, what we can do with big data. So there are many reasons why this historical strong link between US and Europe is even more strong in digital, because we share the same views. And of course, I mean, we care about our industries, our universities. This is perfectly normal. So I'm sure the US colleagues care very much about the advancement of the US industry, and we do the same. But this is not a point of diversity. It's a point that unites us. Because, of course, being government officials, we have this task, I mean, to move ahead our respective industries, which, by the way, are present on both sides of the Atlantic. So for us, all the investments that US companies is doing in Europe, it's really important and precious and valuable, and I'm sure the same applies for our US colleagues. So I think we have many reasons to sit together, not just to share dinner, but to share tomorrow a full day of intense cooperation. And the topics, you know, I mean, will range from the first important topic already discussed at G7 level, which is cybersecurity, where I know Robert has not only expertise, but really, I mean, he has a particular mission, I mean, to advance in terms of making not only, I mean, US, but the world in general more secure in terms of cyber attacks. The same applies for us. so we share again and again also in cybersecurity the same goals and the same mission. I think largely we share also the same approach. There's the necessity to share more information, especially among different entities in the public sphere. That's the philosophy of our NIS directive. That's, I understand, also the effort of the federal government of U.S. Because by information sharing, of course, in a way that not everything can be put open air, but I mean, the right people should know in advance, and the people in general should be informed. This means the possibility to act, to prevent, to move quickly, to solve problems. Same applies when industry wants to, get together, adhere to standards, to, in our case, certification schemes. This should be welcome. Of course, there should be an industrial need to do that. We should be a bit waiting for this need to emerge rather than being immediately having a sort of bureaucratic reflex that we have to impose immediately whatever standard certification means. But in many cases, and again, let me use the case of a connected and autonomous car, there might be the need, the pressing need to have standards in place, industry standards in place. So our Cybersecurity Act, I understand what is going on in the United States with NIST and the rest, are going more or less in this direction to help the various players in the industry to get together and to exchange best practices and to arrive, when necessary, to labeling and certification. We will discuss about connectivity. Without connectivity, there will not be a modern, very advanced society. So I understand 5G is an essential element in the vision of US in terms of what are the key elements of a modern country, and very much the same applies to Europe. It is a clear priority for the Commission, for our President said it to the European leaders very clearly. So that's for us. Tomorrow also is a very important day because we are in the middle of the negotiation of the European Communication Code, and tomorrow is a negotiation day, it's a trial day, and the provisions about spectrum are being discussed with Council and Parliament. And we do hope to make a concrete advancement, especially in the area of frequency release for 5G, and that's in the agenda tomorrow. And you see me smiling, so I go there to this three-way negotiation with a lot of optimism, because I think Council and Parliament do share the importance of releasing quickly 5G in Europe. So we will touch on 5G, we will see in which areas we can work more, probably also looking at the application scenarios for 5G. So 5G, for instance, used in transport or in medicine or in robotics. And also we will reflect together how to help others. The Europe and US are the largest aid donor of the world. So, and in this respect, in a modern world, of course, in a world that we want to see moving on in terms of economic growth and democracy, digital is of course key. And the work we jointly do in ITU, the work we jointly do in terms of development, can be concretely declined in some common initiatives. So we have launched Digital for Development as far as Europe is concerned, which is a digital agenda to actually link development with digital advancement. We have seen impressive things coming up, especially when Vice President Ansip represented the Commission for the digital part at the Africa Summit. We have seen how many African countries are now profiting from the digital revolution, advancing, for instance, government reform, healthcare reform, thanks to digital transformation. So we are commonly convinced this is an area that we should explore, we should talk more about it. So we will make sure that in all these areas, 5G, cybersecurity, development policy, in general digital policy, we will exchange views and see how we can cement and continue our very good cooperation. We will discuss also differences that we have in terms of approach in an open way. There are not so many, but there are some. And so I'm really looking forward for it. I think the message, my final message is that I'm very pleased that this continuing dialogue goes on, so we are number 15, and goes on in a very productive and promising way. And of course open to your difficult questions if you have them. Thank you very much.
Are there any quick, difficult question, or only difficult question perhaps?
Only difficult questions, like
no easy question.
I see there are no difficult questions. That's good.
The thing is that we have a networking reception afterwards with some bubbly drinks, so I think people are eager to take the questions directly to you afterwards. So thank you so much, Mr. Viola.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This concludes today's program. Thank you to all our speakers, our panelists, and everybody in the audience who will ask the difficult question, who either asked already or will be asking that over drinks in a moment. Please join me in a round of applause for all our speakers. And the drinks is next door where you had your coffee when you came in.